Guys, can we just be grateful for these humans who make musical worship possible almost every Sunday? They work hard and they do good things. Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Daniel Bass. For those of you who don't know me, I have been attending Park Avenue for a little over 2 years now. Often I get the privilege of singing with you and at you from up here or over there. But my favorite thing to get to do in church, I think, is to preach. So this is my second opportunity to do so here. I am thrilled for the privilege. So thank you. Thank you for being here. We have been in a sermon series for the last couple of weeks called Mind, Body, and Spirit, where we're looking at those habits and those practices that we can engage that open us up to the Spirit of God, that shape us. A couple of weeks ago, Darcy spoke to us about the mind and how your imagination can be transformed. Last week, Henra spoke about the body. And today, I get to speak with you and listen with you to the Spirit. So we're going to be talking about Spirit this morning. I once had a preaching teacher tell me, here's how you preach the perfect sermon. You tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you just told them. Got it. I think that can be a little bit heavy-handed sometimes, but just, for the sake of experiment, I'm going to give you my thesis from the jump. Not because I don't think that you're smart enough to follow, but because I want to keep myself accountable, make sure to stay on track. So, here's the thesis of this sermon. If you are a person who writes things down, this is like the note. First of all, you have a spirit. Surprise.
It's good. It's good.
You have a spirit. Your spirit is both who you are and it is what you do. So your spirit is your character and it is the action that flows out of that character. All right? So that's point one. You have a spirit. It is who you are and it is what you do. And my second part of my thesis is that our spirits are transformed as we encounter the presence of God in our midst and pay attention. So who you are, what you do gets shaped, gets changed as you encounter the presence of God and you pay attention. Okay? So for today, we're going to look at a couple of stories of folks in the Bible who do this well. We're going to talk about why it is hard as heck for us to do this. And then hopefully we're going to explore some ways that we can do it better on purpose, because spiritual formation is always happening. We're always becoming, right? But it makes sense to do it on purpose, and I'm just like, oh, whoops, now I'm a sucky person who does sucky things. So, that's the great hope. So, that's where we're headed. If you will, please pray with me this morning. Spirit of the living God,
Come on.
fall fresh on me. Harmony, please. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Melt me, mold me, fill me, use me. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on me. Yes. Okay. But we're going to begin with Moses, where many things begin. By the way, just as like a preface, I realized this yesterday and I got tickled and I'm going to share it with you. My current theory on the Bible is the Bible's a little bit like alcohol. Like if you have some responsibly over a long period of time, it's very pleasant. And if you have too much too fast,
Okay.
you're either going to embarrass yourself or hurt somebody.
Whoa.
I'm hoping to straddle the line this morning so that we feel nice, nobody gets sick. So that's just the plan. We're starting with Moses. So Moses is the superstar of the Hebrew Bible, what sometimes Christians call the Old Testament. I love Moses for a couple of reasons. Number one, because he is just so embarrassingly human. I mean, he risks in big ways. He wins hard, he fails hard, and it's funny and wonderful to watch. It gives us permission to be all of who we are, honestly, before God. Because if God really enjoyed Moses' company, surely he will enjoy ours. So there's that. The second reason why I love Moses is because of the DreamWorks animated film, The Prince of Egypt. Perhaps you're familiar. If you're not, I highly commend it to you. But both that movie and Exodus chapter 3 in our Bibles follow and chronicle the events of Moses' life with God, and how Moses is shaped by those encounters. In it, we begin by seeing a very comfortable young Moses who has been adopted into the household of Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the oppressive ruler in the land in this day. He is kind of endlessly and almost maniacally hell-bent on this building project. And he needs a source of cheap labor to do it. And so he has enslaved the Jewish people. So you've got God's people who are enslaved, working endlessly for Pharaoh, who doesn't even really need buildings. He just wants to enslave somebody and have more stuff. Sounds kind of familiar. So Moses, by a set of crazy circumstances, is adopted into the household of Pharaoh, is living as Pharaoh's adopted grandson. He is distracted, he is comfortable, and in most ways insulated from the oppression of his people for much of his early life. That then takes a crazy turn, because one day Moses is out and he notices one of Pharaoh's men abusing and whipping and beating one of these Hebrew slaves who are working endlessly. And Moses is kind of pricked his conscience for the first time, and he rushes in and does something impulsive, and he kills this abuser. So if we're saying that your spirit is who you are, and it's what you do, towards the beginning of Exodus, Moses' spirit is maybe a little sketchy. And I think that's okay to say, regardless of how you feel about violence towards oppressors. The fact that he is kind of comfortable, distracted, occasionally violent, means that at the very least we have the beginning of a good story. We have somewhere to go. But word gets out that Moses has committed this murder, this killing, and so he freaks out. He's afraid, and he flees for his life. So he runs into the wilderness, and he arrives in the land of Midian. So Midian is a place that is not his home. He has left now and gone out into the wilderness. He ends up married to Zipporah. Zipporah is, I just hope you guys are really enjoying the Prince of Egypt recap. Zipporah is the daughter of Jethro, who is the priest of Midian. So like the head honcho of Midian is now Moses' stepfather, and Moses becomes a shepherd. So Moses is out in the wilderness, in a strange land, kind of been driven by fear, by guilt, and he is now a shepherd in the wilderness. And it is as a shepherd that perhaps the most transformative moment of Moses' life transpires. Exodus chapter 3 begins with Moses leading and tending these animals when all of a sudden his normal activity is interrupted. Exodus 3 reads, "There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, 'I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up.' When the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, 'Moses, Moses.' And Moses said, 'Here I am.'" That is the beginning of a conversation between Moses and God. And by the end of it, Moses' spirit is transformed. The core of him, who he is and what he does, are no longer the same. Now he is somebody who speaks with God. He enters this conversation as a shepherd of Jethro's flock, and he exits the conversation as a shepherd of Yahweh's people. There has been this shift, this transformation in who he is. It's only the beginning of one, but his whole life is now oriented in a brand new direction. What strikes me is that the scriptures say God didn't speak until Moses turned aside to see.
Okay.
Right? So if Moses had been like, I'm pretty busy, I really don't want to piss off my father-in-law, lose any sheep, I have things to do, he very well may have gone unchanged. It is my conviction that the presence of God is always flaming out of some bit of creation just on the edge of our vision. If we would only pay attention, turn aside to see it, we might just maybe find our spirits transformed. Now that being said, these moments may not always be as dramatic as bushes on fire. Which brings us to our dear friends, Martha and Mary. Now lots and lots of sermons have been preached on like all of the exegetical questions about these two ladies, like what was their friendship with Jesus like? Was this their first encounter? What does it mean that Martha was the one that welcomed him into the home? And I find those things lovely and interesting, but this is not that sermon. So you are welcome to Google at your leisure. But the thing that I find really important and worth exploring here are twofold. First of all, I am deeply unwilling to paint Martha as the bad guy of this story. Because if somebody doesn't cook dinner, nobody gets to eat. Which strikes me as an ungodly tragedy. Also, the story begins with saying, Martha welcomed Jesus in as a guest. If Martha had not been willing to welcome Jesus in as a guest, we would not have this story. So Martha's not the bad guy and Mary the good guy somehow. These are two people who encountered Jesus and it transformed them in different ways. So just putting that out there from the jump. That being said, the blazing presence of God made flesh is a few feet away from Martha in her home, and she is too distracted to turn aside. Now, I don't think that Mary was like lazy and unhelpful as it somehow, like sometimes the way it's painted. But what I will say about Mary is, I think she knew a burning bush when she saw one. This was a chance for her to sit in the presence of God on holy ground that was normally reserved for men. So when Mary saw it, this opportunity, she took it. And it touched her spirit, and it transformed her. So Martha comes to Jesus and says, hey, I'm slaving away in here. Can you get Mary to maybe come help out? And Jesus calls her name twice, which I just think is a lovely coincidence because God calls Moses his name twice in Exodus, and I'm sure that it's like not super meaningful, but I just love it. But Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted, but there's only really one thing worth doing right now, and I'm not going to be the one to tell Mary she's wrong. If a bush is burning in your living room and you don't pay attention, you've missed a moment to become more alive. He doesn't want Mary to miss it. He doesn't want Martha to miss it either. Because if you miss it, your spirit remains worried and distracted. Now, perhaps you can, like, show of hands, have you ever been worried and distracted? So Martha's not the only one. That description can pretty accurately describe a lot of us. Like Moses, Martha gives us permission to be ourselves, really honestly. Speaking of being very honest, I am a teacher. Right now I'm on summer break, so I'm getting paid all day long to do nothing.
Amen.
Every single day. It is a terrible burden. That being said, while like a bunch of free time sounds really lovely, I find myself often falling into this like pit of worry and distraction. If I'm not careful, I can spend entire like hours and hours just like on YouTube in like strange rabbit holes. You know, just like gospel videos for 3 hours. That's my version of it. I'm sure yours looks slightly different, but that's what happens. And sometimes I'll sit there and I'll be like watching something on Netflix and checking my email and scrolling through Instagram like all at the exact same time. Like, this is disgusting. I've turned into a slug, something must give. I cannot keep doing this. Too often we're plugged in, but we're not connected.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we're really plugged in technologically, but we're not connected to ourselves, to each other, and certainly not to the presence of God in our midst. We're not being transformed, we are staying the same, or if we are being transformed, it's in the wrong direction.
Okay.
I think it's also really important to admit that often we aren't looking for the presence of God in our midst because we're worried we won't find God. We witness so much deadly doing all around us that it can get really hard to believe that God is still acting in the world, right? Our spirits are troubled and distracted, and we're afraid that if we stop and look around, we won't find anything at all. So I want to say, if you find yourself in that place, you are not alone. It does not make you a bad Christian. It does not make you a bad human being. I spent the better part of maybe 2 years after some really painful church hurt avoiding all presence. I was very distracted. I was running. And the biggest reason I was distracted and running is because after all of that church hurt, I thought, if I turn around and try to look God in the face, what if there is nothing there? Wow. And the truth of the matter is, I think most of us have had some sort of experience like that, and I don't really trust anybody who hasn't been in that place. If you're a Christian who has not wrestled with doubt, your religion is not too much use to me.
Come on.
Keep it to yourself. So, the other day I was feeling particularly distracted and not particularly spiritual, and I was sitting there and I realized I was starting to do the multiple screens thing, and I was like, okay, stop, we must escape. So I forced myself to get up and go for a run, which is really a hard thing to do given that I sweat when I think. So in the middle of Georgia heat, it's not a blessing for me to go running, but I was like, you have to do something with yourself or you will just atrophy. So I decided to listen to a podcast while I was running, and I'm listening to a podcast on mindfulness, right? It's all about how to be present in the moment. I was like, yes, present in the moment, got it. And I'm going for it. And by about mile 3, I began to realize the irony of distracting oneself from the present moment by listening to a podcast about being in the present moment. I was like, we're not doing it well. So I take out my headphones, and for the last tiny leg of my little journey, I decide to walk. And I begin to recite these words that I learned from Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Buddhist monk and author, about what it means to meditate. And he says that in order to connect with the breath, with the present moment, all you have to do is, as you breathe in, say, I am breathing in, and I know that I'm breathing in. I'm breathing out, and I know that I'm breathing out. So I'm walking, and I'm doing this, and I'm saying, I'm breathing in, and I know that I'm breathing in. I'm breathing out, and I know that I'm breathing out. And then I start to expand it. I say, I am walking, and I know that I'm walking. I'm looking at trees, and I know that I'm looking at the trees. And suddenly, I was no longer distracted. I wasn't anywhere besides right there in that place. And then I said, I am in the presence of God, and I know that I'm in the presence of God. And it shocked me, because I didn't realize that I believed it until I said it. It felt like God spoke out of that moment, out of that burning bush of a moment, inviting me into something, inviting me to be more trusting, more at home with my place in the world, reminding me that I'm not alone, but God is my neighbor. God is very close by. For at least that moment, my spirit, who I am and what I do, was transformed. All of me in that moment was caught up in aliveness and gratitude. Transformed. Now, the really tragic, difficult thing is, there's kind of no magic spell to make those kinds of moments happen. I wish I could. I wish I could march about constantly I'm in the presence of God. I know I'm in the presence of God. Isn't it lovely? I will share it with you now. But alas, it's not quite that formulaic. We can't make those moments happen, but what we can do is engage the practices, the habits that the church has given us, that wisdom traditions everywhere have given us, to get open, to turn aside from distraction and enter into the sacrament of the present moment. And just, if you are, I'm a nerd and read constantly, if you are a book person, I would like to commend to you a book called An Altar in the World by Barbara Brown Taylor. It is all about these sorts of practices. One time I was commending it to people on Instagram, I hashtag An Altar in the World, and turns out if you don't use capitalization, it looks like anal tar in the world. So Just be careful as you convince it to others. But it is a great book. You should definitely read it. So, I want to commit to you 3 practices today to help you get open to enter into the presence of God, at least somewhat deliberately. And these all begin with S because preachers love alliteration, and just I guess it helps you remember the thing that they want you to do. So, these practices are Sabbath, solitude, and silence. Sabbath, solitude, and silence. And by Sabbath, I don't mean that we kind of stupidly and pitifully try to enact a really beautiful practice that our Jewish brothers and sisters do routinely. I mean that we find ways to deliberately enter into rest. I found something out this week that I didn't really know, and it's that a lot of people feel tremendously guilty when they do nothing at all. Do you feel guilty when you stop doing things? I don't have that problem, unfortunately. But it's a very real one, and I get it. I've comforted myself and say, you're not lazy. You're not a person unable to feel guilt. It's just because you're so godlike, so holy. Because God also does not have that problem. In Genesis, we read that God created all things from nothing, and then took a rest. On the 7th day, it said, this rest is holy. So there's something divine, there's something beautiful, there's something of God to be found in resting. So if you feel guilty and think, I'm not doing enough, tell yourself you are meeting God, and that's a lot more important than the other things you might be trying to do. Okay? So, I want us to Sabbath in a way that calls us to enjoy our place in the family of living things. Sabbath is about enjoyment. It's not about forcing yourself to sit there and do nothing and be bored and wish that it felt fine and it doesn't. It's not that, right? It is the things that we do to enjoy our place in the world, to make us not just plugged in, but connected. So I want us to, for 15 seconds, I want you to think of the people, of the places, of the things, the activities that make you feel really alive and really grateful. Just think for a second. Really think of 2 or 3 people, places, and activities that make you feel alive and grateful. Hopefully you have at least a couple, maybe one from each of those things. Now here's my challenge to you. Choose a day, or if you feel too impossibly guilty to go a whole day, choose a chunk of a day, and get in with those things, those people, those places. Just whatever it is for you. Go for a walk, take a nap, go for a run, climb a rock, sing a song, whatever they are for you, and just see. It's an experiment, right? Rest and see what it makes of you. My next challenge to you is then to do some of those things in solitude. Some of us hate being alone. And whether it's because you get lots of energy from being around other folks, or it's because you hate what you see in yourself when you get alone, often we struggle to be alone well. And I would just like to tell you that your spirit can be refreshed in a way that it cannot when you are surrounded. When you get alone, you can re-encounter the mystery of you and the mystery of God. So resting, doing the things that make you feel alive, doing some of them alone, and then maybe the hardest one, some of them you need to do silently. So not just you need to shut up, but you need to shut up all of the voices that are constantly bombarding you. That means turning off your computer, not checking email, turning off your phone, maybe even, God forbid, leaving it at home. When you go somewhere, get quiet and listen. Now you can tell the folks who do this really well because being with them kind of feels like being in the presence of a burning bush, right? Like they radiate out this joy for being alive, and they make you feel more alive. They are blazing but not consumed. Do you know anybody like that? I think that the person who has most captivated my imagination who is like that is Jesus. Jesus was the sort of person who lived in the presence of God everywhere. No place was off limits in terms of encountering God for Jesus. Because of that, his spirit, both his character and the action that flowed out of that character, drew people to him. Like, people wanted to be around Jesus, and if they see him well, they still want to be around Jesus. If you can get a really clear vision of who Jesus is in front of folks, it's attractive. His religion was not one that made people feel sketched out and want to run in the opposite direction. His religion was love. He made people feel loved and seen. He busted out the good wine at parties. He wasn't afraid to cry with folks who were swallowed up in grief. If you were an outsider, if folks said that person is gross or disgusting or doesn't belong, Jesus would grab you and drag you into the kingdom of God if you would let him. Right? And it makes belief in the presence of God seem real if somebody loves that well. If you see somebody loving really, really well, it makes the idea of God believable in a fresh way. So when we talk about your spirit being transformed, the question that should be on your mind by now is, yes, but transformed into what? And so that is the answer. Into the image of Jesus, into becoming a more and more loving person who makes those around you grateful to be alive and feel more alive themselves. The Eastern Orthodox Church, I don't know if you guys even know that exists. I don't think I did for a very long time. So you've got the Protestant Church, which is us. You've got the Catholic Church, and then you've got the Orthodox Church. I actually love a lot of theologians from the Orthodox Church because they just say things so differently. Wow, that's so refreshing. So in the West, most of us think of salvation like this. Jesus came and died for our sins so that we get to go to heaven when we die, right? For most of us, that is the gospel that you grew up with. Or for those like myself who did not grow up in the church, with the gospel you were puzzled by, because it doesn't sound super exciting. This guy died and you get to go to heaven. It's real confusing. The way that the Orthodox Church talks about it is, they say that Jesus came to us to bring us to God. Jesus became human so that we might become more and more divine. And that doesn't mean that we each become a new member of the Trinity, right? We're not surprise, I'm God now. What it means is that we are drawn more and more into the life of God, deeper and deeper in, so that we in our lives reflect what Jesus' life reflects and shines out. The author of 2 Corinthians writes it like this, so I'm not making this up. This is really kind of what we should be aiming for as folks who are followers of Jesus. The author says this: all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror. So that means we're looking at Jesus and seeing him shine, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. So we're becoming more and more like him every time we see him. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. So here's my challenge to you. I'm going to tell you what I told you. I just did the telling you. I'm going to tell you what I told you. Get rested. Get alone. Get quiet. And you just might stumble upon a bush on fire calling your name. If you do, pay attention. And you'll find your spirit transformed from one degree of glory to another. And then, maybe, just maybe, eventually, we will start to look a little bit more like Jesus. May it be so. Amen.